Welcome to our public health seminar series on green chemistry, finding safer alternatives for occupational applications. This is a joint project between the Rutgers School of Public Health and the Northwest Center for Occupational Health and Safety. We are both education and research centers that are funded by NIOSH. This program is brought to you by the Atlantic Emerging Technologies and Industrial Hygiene Training Center, which is a collaborative effort between the CUNY School of Public Health, Universidad Metropolitana School of Environmental Affairs, and the Rutgers University School of Public Health. And funding is provided by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Both of our programs have significant social media aspects, so we'd like you to join and follow our pages. You can see them here. The program today will be posted on the YouTube channel for Rutgers, and links will be shown from both the UW and the Rutgers Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter feeds, so please follow us. Today we're welcoming Nancy Simcox, who's the Director of Continuing Education Programs at the University of Washington, and she has lots of experience in developing and working on programs designing safer chemicals. And Saskia Van Bergen, who is a green chemistry scientist at the Washington State Department of Ecology. So we are glad to have both of them available today and to present this information to you. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to give the introductory slides on green chemistry. Thank you, Nancy.
Yes, thank you, Mitch. I'm excited to be here today. As an industrial hygienist by training, I just want to let everyone know I first heard about green chemistry when I attended a lecture by Paul Anastas, the director of the Center for Green Chemistry and Green Engineering at Yale University. For me, as an IH, the principles of green chemistry made so much sense and has helped me see the prevention of chemical exposures in the workplace as a more feasible and possible, especially when you get the right experts, disciplines, and decision makers involved. Industrial hygienists, exposure scientists, public health practitioners can play a prominent role in our conversation. We understand the processes, work tasks, work organization, and chemical exposures, all which is needed to develop adequate chemical hazard elimination and substitution. We can help the effort by working with those in the green chemistry field to identify where the efforts are most needed, especially for reducing and preventing worker exposure to hazardous chemicals. Today's webinar is going to be covering the following learning objectives. We're going to describe the historical and current role of chemical regulations. We're going to define the principles of green chemistry and its important role in our society. We're going to discuss green chemistry research applications, and we're going to recognize the need for green chemistry in practice. As you can see here from this graph, the projections for chemical productions continue to increase. We have estimates saying that it will be doubling by the year 2024, index from 2000. And our current status of chemical policy is in the United States, the Toxic Substance Control Act, called TSCA, was passed in 1976 and updated just recently in 2016. It gives EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the authority to require reporting, record keeping, and testing requirements and restrictions to chemical substances and mixtures. We have about 85,000 chemicals in our inventory right now. 60,000 were grandfathered, and I'll note that there were some that have not been on this list, and that includes pesticides in food additives, drugs, cosmetics. These are exempt from this law. Many health and safety tests or requirements were not required for about 60,000 chemicals, and this allowed these chemicals to continue to be used, and it really limited innovation to create new and less hazardous or safer chemicals. Today, under the new TSCA Act that was just passed, EPA has reviewed, because under the new law, they need to prioritize using a risk-based process whether or not chemicals are high or low priority substances. So to date, they have done 1,593 chemicals of our list, which is a great improvement over these 2 years. There's also 3,000 chemicals called high production volume chemicals, and these are chemicals that are produced or imported in the United States in quantities of 1 million pounds or 500 tons per year. And they make up about 99% of the volume of those that are in the market right now. I also want to point out how OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, has issued only 470 permissible exposure limits. So as you see, there's a big gap, and we've tried to do some updating of the OSHA permissible exposure limits, and has not been very successful. So in the last few years, OSHA annotated the PELs by listing occupational exposure limits for substances side by side that are more updated by others, such as the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, their TLVs, the California OSHA PELs, and NIOSH RELs, that are more reflective of current science and are what many industries are using as their best practice. If you look at OSHA's website, you'll see it referenced that there's 190,000 work-related illness and 50,000 deaths that in the United States that are related to chemical exposures. So the problem, as we kind of outlined just now, was that, we know that we have many chemicals, there's benefits, but there's also many unintended consequences from the use of chemicals. They have no intended biological activity, many, lack a lot of experimental health and safety data. They're produced in billion-pound quantities. We lack a holistic assessment process, and many are used in extremely diverse use scenarios. For example, I'm going to just walk you through, here's a case study of methylene chloride. This is a fact sheet developed by the Safety and Health Assessment and Research for Prevention group at the Washington State Labor and Industries. We look at this situation that for 10 years we were seeing workers dying from the use of methylene chloride, a very highly volatile chemical that gets into the lungs. And so after 10 years, we need to start looking at and asking the right questions about, well, are the products on the market, how are they really impacting health, and can we start really reviewing the unintended consequences? And we want to try to begin to look at questions and ask folks that we want to end this kind of thing. So here's what we're used to doing as practitioners is we do our risk assessments, and we evaluate whether the products on the market, what the hazards are, and we estimate the exposures. In many cases, though, we've kind of accepted that we don't know the hazards in many cases, or we're trying to balance between, is it an asthmagen, is it a carcinogen, and how do we want to use that how does that get used in the workplace, and what kind of practices can we take to actually control that exposure? That's been our model. And as I've shown, I'm going to go back to the methylene chloride, that even though with those engineering controls that we know that this exposure can happen, we know that there needs to be fans on, we know there needs to be proper protective equipment, this is a typical unintended consequences that these things aren't actually implicated in the workplace. And we see that their systems fail across for many different reasons, and I'll show you a picture on the right, which is actually what the worker should be wearing if they're going to be doing this bathtub refinishing task. So other examples of unintended consequences you can see up here is the DDT use, which ended up killing the birds because of the eggshells. We have the lead in paint. We have flame retardants coming out of furniture and getting into the dust, as a little arrow here shows on the floor. We know that BPA was a big problem several years ago, and there's been lots of science and research documenting its health effects as an endocrine disruptor. And the unintended consequences is that our children end up becoming exposed, orca whales become exposed, as well as para-occupational exposures occur where workers are carrying different dusts and particles on their work clothes to their home environments. Increasing chemical regulations to try to tackle some of this has been happening. We see that REACH, it's the Europeans passed about 10 years ago, the new law called Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. These are increasing because they want to try to restrict the use of hazardous chemicals and improve the protection of human health and the environment. We're also seeing sectors take over and say, okay, we need to have something like the electronic industry has created regulations as well. They have a whole list under the Restrictive Hazardous Substance Act here with ROS, it's called. And there's also regulations targeting just single chemicals, such as the flame retardants, the decabromo-diphenyl ether. These regulations are all driving the field to fill the gaps in health and environment and pushing industries to consider safer designs. So we are phasing out hazardous chemicals, but what are the alternatives, and are they truly safer? As an industrial hygienist, I've been reaching out and working with my peers and colleagues in the chemistry and pollution prevention world to try to help answer some of these questions and participate in the conversation. We have seen that in many times that the lack of toxicological data on many chemicals and a rapid need to change to another chemical, regrettable substitutions happen. And this tends to be a barrier for many occupational health practitioners because we do not want to recommend something that we aren't sure is safer. A well-known example of this was in the New York Times in 2013. This report describes how a regrettable substitution impacted a group of workers at a factory that glued foam cushions with spray adhesives. The Clean Air Act in 2002 restricted the use of TCE because it was damaged the ozone layer. Companies switched to methylene chloride. It was safe for the ozone layer. However, it was also a carcinogen and neurotoxin. More than 30 workers died in a year, and many more sickened across many industries who made this switch. So then OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, they responded and they tightened safety limits on methylene chloride. And then 1-bromopropane was starting to be used because it's a chemical that doesn't even have a PEL. And industries felt, well, this must be a better chemical because it doesn't have a PEL. Before long, roughly a third of the cushion-making industry had switched to these NPB-based glues. There's been an NPB warning for over a decade that it causes neurological damage and infertility when inhaled at low levels over long periods, and it has grown about 15-fold in the past 6 years. Recently, actually in 2013, that's not so recent anymore, OSHA issued a hazard alert, and the ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, proposed lowering the TLV from 10 to 0.1 parts per million. Another regrettable substitution story for our industry is that in 2000, Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, they requested technical assistance from the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, to investigate the health of former workers of a microwave popcorn plant in Jasper, Missouri. This led to an intensive research and collaboration with this industry and flavoring manufacturers. The studies documented that cumulative exposure to diacetyl vapor over time caused abnormal lung function. Basically, small airways in the lung become scarred and constricted, blocking movement of air for many workers. The one thing I want to point out is in this fact sheet is that NIOSH identified some substitutes that would probably most likely happen, and they made a note to say that the toxicity of these were actually similar to diacetyl. So, trying to help the industry not jump to these kind of substitutions. And that, there was also toxicity data gaps identified. And they really emphasized that relying on engineering controls and personal protective equipment is the way we're going to have to do to prevent illnesses until a real substitute was found. So lots of reasons as to why we need a science of safer chemistry, and why, as an industrial hygienist, I think we need to pursue and promote green chemistry and other frameworks that try to help us go and find safer chemicals. The chemical designers themselves are not trained in toxicology. The exposures are difficult to track and can be significant at low levels. The response to adverse health and environmental effects from chemicals in the market is slow. I think OSHA has passed about 16 new PELs in the 30 years. So, it's very slow to try to respond to the current technology and development of new chemicals. And as I've outlined, drop-in substitutions frequently lack rigorous assessment, so it doesn't necessarily guarantee safety. So here's our chemical risk that we are all very familiar with, that the risk equals the hazard times the exposure. And we are often, like I said, we often have focused many years on documenting our exposure, controlling it, making sure that the scenarios that we're in the workplace we see can be controlled with our engineering. And we don't really focus on the hazard as much because a lot of it is, there's data gaps, a lot of chemicals we don't have information that can really help us, or we don't even try to really compare because there hasn't been a lot of frameworks in that. I do want to point out, I have the Molecular Design Research Network logo down here to the left, and that is a project that I've been involved with, which is kind of the good news. I don't want to show all bad news here. We have good news, is that the chemists and material scientists and others are coming together and interdisciplinary, and they're inventing chemicals now, and not chemicals, but they're trying to design new predicting toxicity tools so that so the industries can start using these and say, okay, this is what we can do to try to predict beforehand what the chemicals might do once we get them released. And the network is led by Paul Anastas and other experts from George Washington, Baylor University, and the University of Washington. So the hierarchy of controls is something we're all familiar with, that we rely on. And I encourage those of you in practice to identify some of the barriers that kind of stop us from focusing on elimination and focusing. I know it's very hard, and it takes getting together a group of many different people at the table to really ask the right questions as to, what can we do and what kind of protocols can we put in place to prevent chemical exposure in the workplace. So I want to focus on some of the tasks here related to safer alternatives. And one of the things to avoid regrettable substitution is that we can start doing is really comparing and looking at chemicals across all the different endpoints. And we're going to share with you today some frameworks that do that and some tools that you can use. I mean, this is pretty overwhelming when you look at this. You're like, oh my gosh, how can I really do all this? And as an industrial hygienist, I tend to, focus on actually looking at the exposure end of things and hoping I can control it that way instead of the hazard end. And also, we want to make sure that we use a holistic framework that can assess life cycle and potential impacts to different populations. That's why I was mentioning earlier that we want to have a framework that doesn't shift the burden. Like if we ban something from the EPA because it's an ozone problem, it then shifts to more toxic chemical in the workplace, like the workers you saw with the foam cushion glues. That we want to stop that kind of thing from happening. And this type of assessment, so there are these frameworks, alternative assessment frameworks in place. It's used a lot by pollution prevention and others that are working on this. And it's a type of assessment known as alternative assessment. It's defined as a process for identifying and comparing potential chemical and non-chemical existing alternatives used as substitutes to replace chemicals and technologies of high concern. These frameworks, they look at the hazard, the performance, cost, availability, exposure, and a lot of us in the field, we already do some of this ourselves when we're working with companies as industrial hygienists. And I point these out to you because there's two resources here. There's one from the Interstate Chemical Clearinghouse where they've actually done this with some different chemicals, as well as the National Academy of Sciences that you can use for your reference. So I want to bring us back to one simple thing of questions that you can start asking when you're doing and looking at, maybe you're helping a company look at managing their chemicals. Like you can start asking, like, is the function really necessary? Is this needed? For example, there's been evidence showing that trichlorosan in soap, for example, it's not really it's not any more effective than just plain soap and water and actually scrubbing your hands. It's really the physical presence of washing your hands that takes off the preventing an illness and spread of disease. Also, companies that have developed water shoes, they actually did a review and realized that they had triclosan there, and they said, why is this present? It's meant to be, the purpose of the shoes are to be wet, and to get wet and to use that, have a water repellent on a water shoe doesn't really make sense. So they removed the chemical. So as I mention these things because as you're going through your reviews and your protocols, look at the function of the chemical and see if you can make changes. And here's an example of where a substitution was found by asking just this question. In designing the Bullitt Center Foundation, they set up a red list, which they basically said, we don't want any of these chemicals listed here that are during the construction of this building. And one of those chemical groups was phthalates. So the architect involved in this had to review all the material safety data sheets, or safety data sheets now they're called, and he had to call vendors and make sure that the products did not contain these agents. The supplier for one of them, the water membrane of this building that they were going to go with, actually had phthalates in it. And so he contacted the company, they talked with them and said, we want a phthalate-free waterproof barrier coating put on this building. And so the company said, give us 6 months to a year. And the architects and construction folks said, okay. And they actually came up with a new product. And this product was then very beneficial for this new company who now is, taken on kind of designing and creating chemicals and looking at these safer way to do things. And also it benefits everyone at all because it's a benefit to avoiding these risks and impacts. And the company was able to do it cost effectively. It created innovation. Companies can actually make money off of doing things in a more sustainable way. So now I'm going to turn it over to Saskia Van Bergen, who will now address the next section of the webinar. Thank you.
Question that you'd ask is, what happens if there were no safer alternatives? Who makes them? And this is where you don't have the right building blocks. You need to go to the synthetic chemist or the formulation chemist. But the problem is that they likely go to another molecule with the same function, so you end up with a regrettable substitution. So chemists, as we mentioned previously, have not traditionally been trained in toxicology, and they're also not really known. The word chemist and sustainability aren't married. They're frequently, chemists are not known for their sustainability. So from this, in the late 90s, two chemists, Paul Anastas, which was mentioned previously from Nancy, and John Warner, came up with a definition for green chemistry. And this is the design of chemical products and processes that reduce or eliminate the use and generation of hazardous substances, with the thought again in mind that if you actually get rid of the hazard, you're removing the chemical risk. And this can apply to both the products, what you make, and how you make it, the process. And it really is trying to address hazards throughout the whole life cycle. And then I also wanted to point out that even though cost is not mentioned in this definition, if a product cannot compete with cost and performance, it won't actually be used and it won't achieve the reduction. And so the next slide shows the 12 principles that were developed with the definition of green chemistry. And these aren't metrics, but they're more elements to focus on. And I color-coded the right-hand side of the principles, but really wanted to show it kind of breaks down to three main themes: eliminating and reducing the hazard, minimizing material waste and energy use, and then also using renewable feedstock. And I'm really actually going to focus on the eliminating and reducing hazards in the couple examples that I mentioned. So in the next slide, you'll see basically this came out of the University of Delaware. And just want to mention for all of these examples, they're chemicals that are designed using the green chemistry principles. We still actually would want to make sure that you're assessing these chemicals and products to determine if they actually were safer alternatives. You really need to make sure that it's aligning with the criteria that you have defined as important for what is a safer alternative. And so in this case, this researcher was looking for alternatives to bisphenol A, which is the molecule on top. And there are a number of different alternatives to bisphenol A, but what they did is they actually decided that BPA is an endocrine disruptor, and they actually wanted to make sure that the chemical that they were producing actually did not have endocrine activity. So what they did is they removed the methyl groups in the middle of this molecule, but actually that still had endocrine activity. So then if you look at the bottom molecule, the VGF, they added the two methoxy groups on the left and right-hand side of the molecule, which actually then inhibited the ability to bind to the active site. And so it made it endocrine inactive. And another factor of this material is that they actually made it from lignin, which is a waste product from paper. So then you go to the next slide. It's another example of an innovation where a researcher at Oregon State University was actually looking at mussels, and he thought it was really interesting the way, they live in the intertidal zone, and they are hot and they're cold, they're wet and they're dry, they get bashed by waves, and yet they still stick. And so what he did, because he was thinking that it's a really strong adhesive, is he modified a soy protein to actually mimic the mussel protein, and now it's actually commercially available as an alternative to urea formaldehyde resins. And then another example, which kind of goes back to the is it necessary kind of train of thought, was this thermal paper, where on the left-hand side, you can see the traditional thermal paper structure. So it actually has a color former, and then it has a developer. In this case, it's bisphenol A, bisphenol S. And what they did is they actually created an alternative that could be used in the thermal printer, but it actually had a totally different chemistry. It was a physical reaction versus a chemical reaction. They created an opaque layer that actually had bubbles in it, making it, opaque. And then they actually had it where they have the colored layer. So basically you're melting the top layer to see the colored layer to actually have the black that you see on the thermal receipt. And it also performs better. So unlike the thermal receipts that actually would fade in your car, these ones are visible over a long period of time. And then another example, which isn't quite a green chemistry innovation, but it's the use of labs that you've done in green chemistry is if you actually switch to a number of green chemistry labs that are reducing or eliminating the hazard, you can also decrease the need for some of the engineering controls. So in this case, you can actually reduce the need for hoods for some of the reactions where you've designed a safer laboratory for your classroom. And so the next couple of slides I want to talk about are tools and resources. And so if you go to the next one, a lot of these are mentioned in the OSHA toolkit for transitioning to safer chemicals. Basically, OSHA wanted to really encourage people to use the 2 steps in the hierarchy of controls to help transition to safer chemicals. And so they developed a 7-step toolkit, which step 1 is to form a team to develop a plan. Step 2 is to examine current chemical use. Step 3 is to identify alternatives. Step 4 is to assess and compare alternatives. Step 5 is to select a safer alternative. Step 6 is to pilot an alternative. And step 7 is to implement and evaluate an alternative. And so if you go to the next slide, I'm not going to go through all of the steps, but I just wanted to show a couple of different elements of these steps. And so for this one, they have key questions, and some of the questions that are, what are the hazards associated with the chemicals, and how could its use harm workers? And also ask what hazards should be eliminated or reduced first, what uses of chemicals are of greatest concern. And then under the further resources, there actually are a number of useful tools that you can use to help with this step. And so if you go to the next slide, some of the tools that are mentioned in this level are tied to assessing chemical hazards. And the tools that are kind of mentioned are red in this case, which are really for screening analysis versus more comprehensive assessment. The ones lower, such as the green screen, is the much more comprehensive assessment, which I'll mention a little bit later, and they're also more complex. So the 2 that I'm going to mention briefly here are the Toxnaut and the Data Commons. And so if you can go to the next slide. This is an example of one of the features of Toxnaut. I'm not going into all the benefits of all these different tools, just highlighting a couple of the elements of the tools that could be useful for this type of process. So this chemical hazard dashboard is nice in the fact it's automated. It can pull a lot of chemical information quickly, so it can help you prioritize inventories, and it also has an element where you can compare a number of chemicals back to back. And this can be used to screen out known chemicals of concern. I think it's a pretty good visualization. And what it does is it pulls from many authoritative lists to show a number of different hazard endpoints, such as those on the slide mentioned earlier, trying to get carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive hazard, or some of the group 1 human health effects, for example. And then you also have skin and eye irritation under the group 2 human health effects. Under egotox, it's acute aquatic and chronic aquatic toxicity, phase persistence. I think that you kind of get the gist of it. And then also, if you look on the upper left-hand side next to each of the names, for example, LT1 is next to dichloromethane, LTP1 is the TCE, and LT1 is the 1-bromopropane. These are green screen list translator results. And this basically is a methodology which uses lists of lists to quickly identify chemicals of high concern. And what it does is it maps the list to hazard endpoints and hazard ranges, and then basically creates a score where an LT1 is a chemical of high concern, and LTP1 is a possible concern. And then if you either have an LT-UNK or is an LT unknown, and NOGSLT is no green screen list translator, which basically means that it has an unknown hazard, and there's a lot less authoritative lists showing that that's problematic. But as I mentioned, these are screening tools. It doesn't mean that the chemicals are safer. But if you look at the different chemicals here, for example, the bottom one was the N-propylbromide that the woman was exposed to with the wood adhesives. You could probably tell that actually maybe this, is not a chemical to switch to, that there's a number of elements and hazards that are of concern. And so one should probably look for a safer alternative. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to show some of the information that's available on each of the chemicals. It pulls from a number of different lists. And so you can see here, like the AOEC, some of the DHS lists. But if you go, you can see all the lists that it's pulling from. And it also has another list where if you go further down on the screen, you can see what actually drives the green screen hazard scores as well. So if you go to the next slide, you can actually see the data commons, which is another chemical hazard dashboard. And this one also has some very similar elements to the ones I described in ToxNet. I pulled the 2 popcorn flavoring chemicals in this case. And from this, you can't necessarily tell, it wouldn't necessarily filter as a chemical of high concern. And so you probably would need to look into it a lot more. But you do have a starting point where it's pulling all the lists together, so you could actually use that to evaluate and then potentially communicate it to an audience that you're working with. But 2 features that I want to mention about the data commons are the discussion board, which it kind of relates to step 3, whereas if you're looking for alternatives, you can always ask the discussion board questions, and they potentially could help you. Basically the idea of that is to kind of build a community around safer alternatives. And so it's a place that I'd recommend asking questions, as well as there's beta testing of function section, which basically, if you typed in the word butter, for example, and it wasn't all butter flavoring, but I found 17 different chemicals. And so you might in the future, as it gets built out, be able to help identify alternatives by using this tool. So if you go to the next slide, this is step 3, identifying alternatives. And I wanted to mention a couple different resources that were listed in this one. The next slide shows the Safer Chemical Ingredient List, which is an Environmental Protection Agency whitelist, basically. And what they do is they actually compare chemicals against master criteria to make sure that they meet a certain, they've been evaluated for certain hazard endpoints and that they are safer. And then they also have additional criteria for different functions. So for example, there's additional functions for, if it's a fragrance or if it's a solvent or if it's a surfactant, and you have to meet those criteria as well to be listed. And they have green circles, green half circles, and then yellow triangles. And the green circles basically mean that they've been verified to low concern based on experimental and model data. The half circles actually mean that they have also been identified as lower concern, but additional data would help strengthen the status. And then the yellow triangles basically mean that they're the best in class at this point in time, but that they definitely have some hazards associated with them. And then this lists specific chemicals, but it actually doesn't tell you who the suppliers are. And so, it could be that you're buying that chemical and it has a bunch of impurities in it that actually wouldn't meet the safer choice criteria. So an additional resource that's related is called Clean Ingredients, which has improved ingredients. And I'm actually showing you a few slides in it just to kind of emphasize what's in it, because unlike ToxNet and Data Commons, which are free, you just need to log in, this one has a really low fee, but I feel like it might be enough of a barrier where I wanted to show you some of the information that it demonstrates, or I want to demonstrate some of the information that it contains. So if you go to the next slide, this is what would happen when you log in. You have the all ingredients page, and it has different functional classes. So could I see in this case solvents and the different categories that the chemicals are, but you have the product names and you have the companies. And then if you go to the next slide, if you clicked on one of these, you would actually get a profile, and in it you have some information on the chemical, some of the really basic required data, VOC content, listed as CMRs and PBTs. And then it also gives you the sales name and contact information. And then if you go to the next slide, frequently it's voluntary, but they have additional information such as technical data, so the applications that could be used in, the safety data sheets, as well as some of the physical chemical properties of the chemicals. And then the next slide shows some of them are formulations, and so they encourage transparency. So they also would be listing the different chemicals that are in their products. And then the lower right, I just kind of wanted to show the cost for the formulators, which basically be people who are looking for the places to purchase these chemicals. If you're a nonprofit or government agency that's fairly small, it's $150 per year. And if you're a formulator, less than $5 million, it's $250 per year. So pretty low bar with respect to pricing. So I just wanted to call out the price for the resource. So associated with this, but not in the OSHA toolkit, is the EPA Safer Choice product labeling program. And this basically has 3 different logos. It used to be the one on the left with the globe, the design for an environment, but they rebranded a couple years ago and created 3 different logos, one for households, which is the one on the top, one that's more for industrial and institutional use, and then the bottom one is fragrance-free, which actually means that it has no chemicals with the function of fragrance. And unscented is actually different because sometimes you put in fragrances to make it unscented. But you can go and look for different products and based on product types. And I just wanted to call out a couple product types: all-purpose cleaners, floor strippers, HVAC maintenance, medical instrument cleaners, odor removers. And then I think it's always fun to go to the other business products because sometimes you find a product that you would never think of finding, but it's listed as other. So I just recommend checking that out every once in a while. And then 2 other resources that are under this session are the IC2 Alternative Assessment Library, which is the Interstate Chemical Clearinghouse, who tries to pull existing alternative assessments. And so then I remind you that this is to identify alternatives, and it might be that these alternatives don't meet the criteria that you're looking for, but it is a good place to find certain alternatives for the applications that you're looking at if there has been one that's been done before. And then the next slide also shows another database, which is the OECD Toolbox, which also has case studies available on some alternative assessments. So step 4, I'm only going to call out one resource in this one. In this step, you're really looking at hazard, performance, and cost, and it has a bunch of resources for the different ones. But since my theme has been hazard for the most part, I really wanted to call out one hazard assessment tool, which if you go to the next slide, is the bottom one on this list. It's the green screen, which is a much more comprehensive assessment. So if you can go to the next slide, I did a screen capture of what it looks like. So basically, it's based significantly on global harmonized system, but it includes evaluation of the 18 hazard endpoints, and it does a comprehensive review of all the available data. So it looks not only at the list, but it also has it where this professional toxicologists look at the primary literature as well as look at analogs and do some modeling to fill in the data gaps. And so it's benchmarks 1 through 4. So in this case, the benchmark 1 is a chemical to avoid, chemical of high concern. Benchmark 4 is ideal. And so if you want to learn more about the methodology, the link is on the top, and there are some publicly available green screens listed on the bottom in the links. And so this is the summary table. So you can see for all the different hazard endpoints, it has high, low, moderate, and then for the data that was modeled, that's where you get the italicized text versus the bold. And then DG does mean that there's a data gap for that endpoint. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to show an example endpoint. So this is what goes into in this case, the high ranking for carcinogenicity. So you have a summary as to why it got that high ranking, but also you can see all the data that was used to go into that decision for that endpoint. So the next slide, I just want to talk about training opportunities briefly. And one of them, which is the next one, is the OSHA 7225 Transition to Safer Chemicals training. And this is talking about the 7-step process. And it has a lot of different hands-on activities that are connected to case studies. It helps you, learn more about these tools that we've been talking about and other tools, shows some resources and databases. And really the manual has like a wealth of information. It's, I think, it's somewhat unique to training where it actually is just a book you can read on your own and has tons of information. So I strongly recommend you take this class and look at the book. And this is done at the different OSHA Training Institute Education Centers. I put the link for the University of Washington one, but there's others. I say check with your local training center. If you go to the next slide. This is another free resource. So it's the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council's Safer Chemistry Training for Businesses. And this was designed for businesses. And what it is it's a number of lightly edited webinars. So you can go to specific speakers if you wanted to. It has the presentations and then sometimes your recommended prerequisites. So most of them are introductory. And then it has links to additional material that you might find useful. And I just showed you the screen capture of one of the pages that you would see, and this one's for chemical hazard assessments, informing decisions for safer chemicals, materials, and products. So this is one that I thought might be of interest to this audience. Then if you go to the next slide, this is if you really wanted to do a much deeper dive into learning more about this. This is the online Green Chemistry and Chemical Stewardship Certificate Program at University of Washington in their continuing ed programs through the Northwest Center for Occupational Health and Safety. It started a couple of years ago. The next group is starting in the next couple of weeks. But if you want to learn more about it, there's recorded informational webinars available on their website that I listed there. Also, you know, I'm sure Nancy would be happy to talk to you about the program, but it has a lot of tools and discussion boards. And also what's really nice is the cohort you're working with has a number of different backgrounds and perspectives that help broaden your learning. And then the next slide, I just wanted to show, and this is our website at Ecology. We have different trainings listed, but I wanted to call out some specific ones on some of the items we've been talking about here. I didn't talk a lot about TURI, which had the P2 Oasis tool, the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, but they have a bunch of excellent webinars that are available on their website as well. So with that, I really apologize for the technical difficulties, but I thank you for your attention, and thanks Mitch and Nancy for having me participate.
Great, thank you, Saskia. I have Nancy, I think we'll be able to hear and talk for questions. So if anybody does have a question, please type them into the chat box, and Nancy and Saskia will answer them for you. So the first one is, how comfortable should a consumer be relying on the Safer Choice seal, or is that just one screening tool?
At Ecology, and this is, you know, my perspective in the group that we work with in Ecology, I would say comfortable. I think it's one of the eco logos that we really recommend. It is more than just the identifying of alternatives. It has shown that it's been identified as safer, but I'd say that if, you know, you're someone who really likes to read labels, what you can do is it's openly accessible, the master criteria, as well as the functional the criteria that's for additional functional endpoints, and so you can review them yourself. But I would say that I'm confident in recommending them as alternatives.
Okay. And it's been in place for 15, this is Nancy, over 15 years, where they've really made it as transparent as possible of a process for folks. So I think, yeah, I would agree with Saskia.
Great, thanks, Nancy. The next question is, regarding the EPA Safer Choice database, what type of chemical products do you find there? Is it mainly cleaning chemicals?
Well, I think Saskia gave a list where she showed examples of other categories, the solvents, maintenance, chemical products. I mean, a lot of the history of how I think a lot of the green products have come out, it has been with cleaners. There is a history of that. That's where we started. I think it was the Park Service that actually started looking at this in a pilot project many years ago. So that's probably been the most effective category, but no, I would agree. I would say there's more. There's other categories you can find safer chemicals in.
And to add to Nancy, because I do agree, is if you go to clean ingredients, there have been a couple chemicals such as alternative plasticizers, which I mean, and it's only a few, but this is where I'm curious to see if it's going to be growing. Chemicals that meet the Safer Choice criteria upon approval of EPA, and you know, obviously working with clean ingredients and the third-party verifiers can be listed in clean ingredients, but it wouldn't be on the Safer Choice product list. So that's more for a formulator. But yeah, I think, you know, some of it's going broader, but it is definitely known most for its cleaning products.
And yeah, there's also other, we didn't talk about all the resources because there's quite a lot more to explain, but in the OECD, there's another, Subsport is another portal where people actually can discuss and show case studies of where they've, you know, really honed in and targeted on using a specific chemical for a specific application. And you can look to see in that list, it's not a long list, but it's a place to get started, as well as there's other databases. That's the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, I think, has put together the cleaner database that it involves a lot of cleaning, but it also has you know, products again used by maintenance that you can actually state, I'm looking for a product that is going to clean off this greasy material in this dirt, for example. You know, like it has a whole list of different applications that you can be more specific for what you're looking for.
The next question is, can you comment on the reliability and the quality of the ATSDR toxicological profile data bank?
Well, the ATSDR is one of the authoritative lists that is in many of these categories that she is cited as a reference. I mean, some of the data is older. It depends on what year, I guess, the ATSDR profile of that chemical's been done. You know, you always have to go back to the literature, you know, the research literature. You need to always update and make sure that every year you're looking at a document for is updated. I mean, I think that's what we would all do in practice.
Great, so there's no more questions, but we do have a couple of journals to recommend to you. There's the Green Chemistry Journal published by the Royal Society of Chemistry. There's the ChemSusChem a journal, and Green Chemistry Letters and Reviews, and the Journal of Industrial and Engineering Chemistry, which are all good resources for everybody to find information about the latest research on green chemistry.
Oh yeah, I can talk about this, Mitch.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't get to talk about this because for some reason I got disconnected. But one of the things, the good news is one of the things I wanted to explain is that a lot of the chemists and material scientists are now inventing and trying to design chemicals that can, and actually systems to do for tools for predicting toxicity during the design phase. And I was involved in a multidisciplinary research grant, an effort called MODERN, which is the Molecular Design Research Network, again led by Paul Anastas and others from Georgia, Washington University and Baylor University and the UW. So the team worked to help develop and validate computer models for predictive toxicology. And as part of our educational team, we put together a computer game. And so this is an example of it to give students early on the opportunity to start thinking about these new concepts. And you can select different combinations of molecular parameters that lead to changes in toxicity and performance. And by the end of the game, you've looked at these different parameters and you'll, which will lead you to a safer product. Again, it's a tool that's used for high school or undergraduate level. And I put down the links there if you would like to check it out. If anyone's doing education, this is a cool thing.
Great. You want to talk?
And then, I guess related to green chemistry education, just wanted to mention the Green Chemistry Commitment, which is an effort that's done through Beyond Benign. It's for the higher education audience, but basically what it is schools sign on to say that they're incorporating green chemistry into their chemistry departments. And, it's kind of at the level and speed of the different schools. I highlighted some of the ones in New York and New Jersey and also Washington. But there are a number of different work groups in this effort. There's some for improving organic chemistry curriculum, but there's also a whole effort, a toxicology work group to try to help provide tools and resources on toxicology for green chemistry chemistry departments. So just if you work with schools, I'd also recommend checking this out and contacting Beyond Benign.
Great. Well, thank you both Nancy and Saskia for this great webinar on green chemistry. We will be having a second one on October 8th. Was it the 18th?
think so. I don't have it in front of me either, sorry.
Yeah, so October 18th at 3 o'clock on Eastern Time. So we look forward to hearing from you and seeing. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or to Nancy and Saskia directly. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.